The air in the emergency room at Metropolitan General was a soup of controlled panic. It smelled of antiseptic, latex, and the faint metallic tang of blood. Monitors beeped in a discordant symphony, each one a fragile tether to a life hanging in the balance. Nurses moved with a practiced, almost frantic efficiency. Doctors barked orders, their voices sharp instruments cutting through the noise. And then there was Clara. Clara Miller moved through the chaos like a ghost in molasses. While others darted, she shuffled. While others snapped to attention, she flinched. Her shoulders were perpetually hunched, her gaze fixed firmly on the polished linoleum floors. Her brown hair, dull and lifeless, was always falling into her face, a convenient curtain to hide behind. She was the department's designated menial labor, a registered nurse who was somehow deemed too clumsy, too slow, too fragile for any real nursing. Her tasks were simple: stocking supply closets, wiping down gurneys, changing linens. She was a shadow that trailed in the wake of real medical professionals, cleaning up the messes they left behind. The other nurses, mostly younger and sharper, either ignored her or treated her with a kind of pitying contempt. They called her Clumsy Clara behind her back, and sometimes not so far behind. A tray of sterile instruments clattered to the floor. Every head in the immediate vicinity turned. Clara stood frozen, her hands hovering in the air where the tray had been a moment before. Her face flushed a deep, painful crimson. She immediately dropped to her knees, fumbling to pick up the scattered scalpels and forceps, her hands trembling. "For God's sake, Miller, can you do anything right?" The voice was a whip crack. It belonged to Dr. Alistair Finch, chief of trauma surgery. He stood over her, a titan in blue scrubs, his handsome face twisted into a mask of pure disgust. He was a god in this hospital, a surgical genius with hands that could perform miracles. He was also a narcissist, with a cruel streak a mile wide, and Clara was his favorite target. "I'm sorry, doctor," she whispered, not looking up. "It slipped." "It slipped," he mimicked in a high, mocking voice. A few of the sycophantic residents nearby snickered. Maya, a junior nurse who sometimes offered Clara a kind word, looked away, her jaw tight. "Everything slips with you, Miller. Trays, charts, your last two brain cells. We're trying to save lives here, not run a daycare for the terminally incompetent. Look at this. This entire set is contaminated. Do you have any idea how much this costs?" He gestured wildly at the instruments on the floor. I'll get a new one right away," Clara stammered, her fingers fumbling with a pair of hemostats. Finch let out a sound of pure exasperation. He reached down and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into her bicep like a vice. He hauled her to her feet. "No, you will not. You will get out of my trauma bay. Go. Stock the linen closet on the 3rd floor. Maybe you can handle folding towels without causing a multi-casualty incident." He shoved her backward. She stumbled, catching her balance just before she hit a supply cart. The laughter was more open now. Humiliation washed over her, hot and suffocating. She turned and fled, her head bowed, the sound of their amusement chasing her down the hall. She didn't see the concerned look from Maya, or the flicker of unease from a senior doctor who knew Finch had gone too far, but would never dare to say it. She hid in the quiet solitude of the 3rd-floor linen closet, the clean scent of bleach and cotton a small comfort. Her arm throbbed where Finch had grabbed her. She leaned her head against a stack of folded sheets, her eyes squeezed shut. The rhythmic beeping of the ER faded, replaced by another sound in her memory, the thwump, thwump, thwump of helicopter rotors. The scream of incoming fire, the smell of sand and cordite. She pushed the memory down, burying it deep. That life was over. Captain Clara Reed was gone, buried in a dusty corner of Afghanistan, along with the people she had failed to save. All that was left was clumsy Clara Miller, a mousy nurse who couldn't even hold a tray steady. It was safer this way, quieter. No one expected anything from her. No one depended on her. There was a strange sort of peace in being utterly, completely underestimated. She took a deep, shuddering breath and began to fold towels. Her movements were slow, deliberate, each fold a tiny act of rebuilding the walls around her past. For hours, she lost herself in the mindless, repetitive task. It was a form of meditation. The hospital, with its noise and its pain and its arrogant gods like Alistair Finch, felt a world away. She was just a woman in a closet, folding towels. That was all she wanted to be. But the quiet never lasted. A code blue blared over the hospital's PA system, the alert sharp and insistent. Her training, buried under layers of self-imposed meekness, still responded. Her head snapped up. Her heart rate kicked up a notch. But she forced it back down. It wasn't her problem. Not anymore. The relative peace of her exile was shattered when the double doors to the hallway burst open. A new wave of chaos had arrived. Paramedics yelled, pushing a gurney at a near run. Multiple GSWs, John Doe, picked up from that pileup on the I-5. Vitals are crashing. Clara peeked out of the closet. The man on the gurney was a wreck. He was unconscious, his face a mask of blood and dirt. His clothes were torn and soaked, revealing a patchwork of deep lacerations and the dark, weeping holes of gunshot wounds. He looked like a vagrant caught in something terrible. Another piece of human wreckage for the ER to process. Dr. Finch, drawn by the commotion, strode toward the incoming trauma. He glanced at the patient with a dismissive air. Another one from the highway collapse? What's this one's story? John Doe, no insurance, I presume? Looks that way, Doc, a paramedic replied, breathless. He was in the middle of it. BP is 80 over palp, pulse is 140 and thready. Finch peeled back one of the man's eyelids with a thumb, shining a penlight into the pupil. Standard trauma protocol. Get him to Bay 2. Type and cross for 6 units O-neg. Push 2 of saline wide open. Let's get x-rays of the chest and abdomen. I want to rule out a tension pneumo and internal bleeding. Move, people! His team jumped into action, a whirlwind of efficient motion. They swarmed the patient, cutting away his ruined clothes, attaching monitor leads, prepping IV lines. Clara, drawn by a force she didn't understand, drifted out of the hallway and stood near the edge of the room, ostensibly to restock a glove dispenser. She kept her head down, trying to remain invisible. But her eyes, the one part of her she couldn't dull, were locked on the John Doe. Finch was barking orders, his ego filling the room. The bullet wounds look like through and throughs, probably a small caliber. The real danger is exsanguination from a liver lac or a ruptured spleen. Page ortho for the femur fracture. I'll take him to the OR myself once we get him stabilized. We'll patch him up and ship him to county. I need this bay clear for that councilman's wife who's coming in with chest pains. He was moving fast, making assumptions based on the obvious injuries. He saw a homeless man, a drain on resources, a problem to be solved and discarded as quickly as possible. Clara saw something else. Her gaze wasn't on the dramatic, bloody wounds. It was on the small, almost imperceptible details. The strange, rhythmic twitching, fasciculations, in the man's calf muscles. The way his pupils were constricted to tiny pinpricks, even when the penlight was removed. The slight, almost unnoticeable cyanosis around his lips. A bluish tinge that spoke of oxygen deprivation that the pulse oximeter wasn't fully explaining. And then she saw it. On the side of his neck, just below the jawline, partially hidden by grime and a trickle of blood from a scalp wound, was a tiny mark. It wasn't a cut. It wasn't a scrape. It was a puncture. 2 minuscule, perfectly parallel dots, no bigger than a pinhead. It looked like an insect bite, something anyone else would have dismissed. Clara felt a jolt, as if lightning had struck the base of her spine. The linen closet, the hospital, the identity of clumsy Clara evaporated. She was back in a dusty field tent, the air thick with the smell of ozone and fear. She was looking at a soldier who had been tagged with a custom delivery neurotoxin, a weapon designed to mimic the symptoms of massive trauma to fool battlefield medics. A weapon that reacted catastrophically with standard resuscitation drugs, specifically with the paralytics used for rapid sequence intubation. The saline was fine. The blood was fine. But if Finch decided to intubate, and he would, the cocktail of drugs he would use would send the John Doe into irreversible cardiac arrest. The toxin would potentiate the succinylcholine, causing hyperkalemia so severe his heart would simply stop. It would look like he died from his injuries. No one would ever know the truth. The fog in her mind was gone, burned away by adrenaline and years of hardwired training. She moved before she even made a conscious decision to. She stepped forward, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the noise of the trauma bay. "Dr. Finch." He turned, his face a thundercloud of annoyance. "What is it, Miller? I thought I told you to go fold something." "You can't intubate him," she said. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. A shocked silence fell over the bay. The other nurses and doctors stared, mouths agape. Clumsy Clara giving orders to God? Finch's eyes narrowed to slits. What did you just say to me? He asked, his voice dangerously low. Don't use succinylcholine, Clara stated, her voice devoid of the tremor that usually defined it. His potassium will skyrocket. It will kill him. Look at his neck, the puncture wound. Look at the fasciculations in his gastrocnemius. He's been exposed to a nerve agent, a binary compound, probably organophosphate-based. Finch stared at her as if she had started speaking in tongues. He glanced at the patient's neck, then back at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and incandescent rage. A nerve agent? Are you insane? This is a car crash victim, not a character in a spy movie. You've been watching too much television, Miller. You are dangerously out of your depth. Doctor, I'm telling you. No, I'm telling you, he snarled, stepping into her personal space. You will step away from my patient. You will not speak another word, and you will get me the RSI kit, now. That is a direct order. He was going to kill him. Out of sheer pig-headed arrogance, he was going to kill this man. Clara looked at Finch, then at the John Doe on the gurney. In that moment, a choice was made. The quiet life she had tried to build for herself was a cage, and the door had just been blown off its hinges. Captain Clara Reed was back in command. She gave a short, sharp nod. Yes, Doctor. She turned and walked toward the drug cart. Finch watched her with a smug, triumphant sneer. He had put the mouse back in her place. But as soon as her back was to him, Clara's entire posture changed. Her movements became fluid, economical, precise. There was no hesitation, no fumbling. She reached the cart. Her hands moved with blinding speed. She pulled a vial of saline and a syringe, pretending to draw it up. But her other hand, hidden from Finch's view by the cart itself, palmed a vial of atropine from an emergency kit. It wouldn't cure him, but it would temporarily block some of the toxin's effects, buying precious time. With a movement too fast to follow, she swapped the syringes. She walked back to the gurney. Here's the flush, Doctor, she said, her voice once again meek. She pushed the atropine into the patient's IV port. Good, Finch said, not even looking. He was too busy examining the x-rays that had just been brought in. Now, where is that RSI kit? I want to tube him before we move to the OR. Right away, Clara said, but she didn't move toward the kit. She walked calmly toward the exit of the trauma bay. Miller, where the hell are you going? Finch roared. Clara didn't stop. She pushed through the double doors and broke into a run. Her destination was the hospital's main pharmacy, 3 floors up. She knew what the patient needed. Pralidoxime. And lots of it. A drug not commonly stocked in the ER. She also knew something else. There was a small, secondary pharmacy on the surgical floor, a reserve for the operating rooms. It had a separate, high-security inventory, and she had the code. It was a memory from another life, a security briefing in a forward operating base. A man from the agency had given them a series of override codes for civilian infrastructure in case of emergency. Codes for power grids, communication hubs, and high-security pharmacies in major metropolitan hospitals. She had never imagined she would use one. She reached the surgical floor, her lungs burning, but her mind clear as ice. The secondary pharmacy was a small, windowless room with a heavy steel door and a digital keypad. She punched in the 12-digit alphanumeric code from memory. The light on the keypad flashed from red to green. A heavy click echoed in the quiet hallway. The door swung open. Inside, the air was cool and sterile. She scanned the shelves, her eyes flying over the labels. Diazepam, fentanyl, rocuronium. There. Pralidoxime chloride. 2 PAM. An entire case of it. She grabbed 4 vials, shoving them into her pockets, along with a handful of syringes. She raced back towards the ER, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She was acting on pure, instinctual training. Save the patient. That was the only mission that mattered. The consequences could be damned. When she burst back into the trauma bay, Finch was standing over the patient, a laryngoscope in his hand, ready to intubate. He had a vial of succinylcholine in his other hand. "Stop!" Clara yelled. Finch looked up, his face a mask of fury. "You're finished, Miller. Security is on their way. Clara ignored him. She moved to the patient's other side, pulling a vial and syringe from her pocket. Her hands were a blur as she drew up the antidote. "What do you think you're doing?" Finch bellowed, moving to intercept her. "Get away from him!" He lunged, grabbing for the syringe. Clara's reaction was not the flinch of a timid nurse. It was the precise, brutal counter of a trained soldier. She pivoted on her heel, using his own momentum against him. Her free hand came up, striking the nerve cluster on his inner arm. His grip loosened instantly with a cry of pain and surprise. In that split second, she plunged the syringe into the patient's IV port and depressed the plunger. The antidote shot into his system. Finch stared at his tingling arm, then at her, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. He had never been touched, never been challenged, never been physically bested in his own kingdom. What did you just do?" he stammered. "I saved his life," Clara said, her voice cold as steel. She was already drawing up a second dose. Just then, 2 burly security guards stormed into the bay. "There she is. Dr. Finch, you called?" Finch pointed a trembling finger at Clara. "Her. She assaulted me, and she's injecting an unknown substance into my patient. Stop her. Get her out of here." The guards moved to grab her. Clara didn't even look at them. She finished injecting the second vial. "You'll need to continue this every hour for the next 12 hours, she said, her words not directed at Finch, but at Maya, the junior nurse, who was staring with wide, terrified eyes. "And keep him away from any depolarizing neuromuscular blockers." The guards grabbed her arms, pulling her away from the gurney. She didn't resist. She had done what she could. The mission was complete. "You're fired!" Finch screamed, his face purple with rage. "You hear me, Miller? Fired! I'll see to it you never work as a nurse in this country again. I'll have your license. I'll have you arrested. Get her out." The guards dragged her, limp and silent, through the emergency room. The staff stared, a sea of shocked and confused faces. They were dragging her past the front desk, toward the main entrance. They shoved her through the automatic doors and out into the cold, drizzling rain. The doors slid shut behind her, sealing her out. Clara stood on the pavement, the rain plastering her thin scrubs to her skin. She was jobless. She was probably going to face charges. She had thrown away her quiet life. She looked down at her hands. They were steady. For the first time in 3 years, they were completely, perfectly steady. She had just started walking, with no destination in mind, when a sound began to cut through the city's drone. A deep, rhythmic chopping. It grew louder, closer, impossibly loud. She looked up. Dropping out of the low gray clouds were 2 shapes, sleek, black, and menacing. UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters. They weren't heading for the hospital's rooftop helipad. They were descending directly toward the interstate that ran in front of the hospital entrance. Cars screeched to a halt. Horns blared in confusion and anger. The helicopters landed with practiced, impossible precision, their rotors washing the street with a hurricane of wind and rain. Ropes dropped from their open doors, and elite, black-clad soldiers rappelled to the ground before the skids even touched the asphalt. They moved with a terrifying, silent efficiency, forming a perimeter, securing the area. The emergency room doors slid open again as staff rushed out to see the source of the commotion. They stared in stunned silence at the military invasion happening on their doorstep. A team of 6 soldiers, led by an officer with captain's bars on his collar, broke off from the main group and marched directly toward the hospital entrance. They didn't storm, they walked. But their presence was more intimidating than any charge. The lead captain approached the terrified receptionist at the front desk. His face was grim, all business. "I'm Captain Jennings, 75th Ranger Regiment," he said, his voice calm but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "We are here for a U.S. asset. We're also looking for one of ours, a medic, codename Angel." The receptionist stared blankly. "Angel? I don't know anyone by that name." Back in the ER, Finch was preening. He was on the phone with the hospital administrator. "Yes, I handled it. A completely unstable nurse, a danger to patients. She's been terminated and ejected from the premises." "What? What helicopters?" He trailed off as Captain Jennings and his team entered the ER. The controlled chaos of the room froze into a tableau of silent shock. Every doctor, every nurse, every patient who was conscious, stared at the heavily armed soldiers standing in their midst. "Who's in charge here?" Jennings demanded.
Finch, puffing out his chest, stepped forward. I am Dr. Alistair Finch, Chief of Surgery, and this is a sterile environment. You are not permitted. "We have a man here," Jennings cut him off, ignoring his title. "Brought in as a John Doe. Gunshot wounds, multiple trauma." "He's my patient," Finch said haughtily, "and he's being prepped for surgery." "You will not touch him," Jennings said flatly. "Where is the medic who treated him?" "The medic?" Finch scoffed. "You mean the incompetent nurse I just fired for assaulting me and injecting him with God knows what? I had her thrown out. She's probably halfway to the nearest asylum by now." Captain Jennings' face hardened. A look of cold fury passed between him and his men. "You threw her out?" Meanwhile, Clara was shivering on the sidewalk. A sleek black SUV with government plates had pulled up silently beside her. The back window rolled down. Inside sat a man in a crisp, formal uniform, a constellation of stars on his shoulder. His face was weathered, kind, but his eyes held the unmistakable look of command. "It's been a long time, Captain Reed," General Marcus Thorne said, his voice a low rumble. Clara stared, speechless. General Thorne was her former commanding officer, the man who had pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on her uniform in a dusty, windswept ceremony. The man she had last seen on the worst day of her life. "Sir?" she whispered. "Get in, Clara. We have a situation," he said gently, "and it seems you're already in the middle of it." She got into the warm, dry car. Thorne handed her a thick military jacket. As she wrapped it around her trembling shoulders, he explained. "The John Doe is Master Sergeant Elias Vance, Delta Force. He was on a deep cover operation to retrieve intelligence on a new chemical weapon being sold on the black market. The car crash wasn't an accident. It was a failed assassination. They tagged him with the toxin, expecting him to die on the operating table." "How did you find me?" Clara asked, her voice barely audible. Thorne pointed to a small blinking device on a console inside the SUV. "The antidote. The proladoxime in that secure pharmacy is part of a strategic national reserve. Every vial is tagged with a micro GPS tracker that activates the moment it's removed from its case. It sends an automatic alert straight to my desk. When the vial of 2 p.m. moved from the pharmacy to the ER and then stopped, we knew one of two things had happened. Either an enemy had gotten to our supply, or a friendly with deep operational knowledge was on site. I took a gamble on the latter. I took a gamble on you." He looked at her, his expression softening. "You did good, Clara. You saved his life." The SUV pulled up to the hospital entrance, right behind the line of soldiers. General Thorne got out, and Clara followed him, clutching the heavy jacket around her. The soldiers saw their general and snapped to attention. Captain Jennings jogged over, his face grim. "Sir, we have a problem. The civilian doctor in charge, he fired Angel." "I'm aware, Captain," Thorne said, his voice like rolling thunder. "A problem we are about to correct." He strode into the emergency room, Clara walking just behind his shoulder, flanked by the armed soldiers. The ER staff stared as the woman they had seen dragged out in disgrace returned with an honor guard. Finch was in the middle of arguing with Captain Jennings. "I don't care who you are. This is my hospital, and that woman is not coming anywhere near my patient." "He is not your patient anymore, Doctor." Finch spun around at the sound of Thorne's voice. He saw the stars on the general's shoulders and paled slightly, but his arrogance was too ingrained to fully retreat. "And who might you be?" "I am General Marcus Thorne, United States Army," he announced, his voice booming through the silent room. "And this entire wing of the hospital is now under temporary military jurisdiction by order of the Department of Defense under the National Security Act. This patient," he pointed to Elias Vance on the gurney, "is a critical asset to the United States government, and his primary physician," Thorne put a hand on Clara's shoulder, "is standing right here." The entire room stared at Clara, at the mousy, clumsy nurse, now standing beside a 3-star general, wrapped in a military jacket, her face set like stone. Finch's jaw worked, but no sound came out. He looked from Thorne to Clara and back again, his brain failing to process the reality of the situation. He sputtered. "Her? She's a nurse, a clumsy, incompetent. You will address her as Captain Reed,"
Thorne cut him off, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. Captain Clara Reed is one of the most decorated combat medics in the last 2 decades. She has more experience with battlefield trauma and exotic ordnance than your entire surgical staff combined. She correctly diagnosed a targeted chemical attack that you, in your hubris, completely missed. You were about to kill a national hero, Doctor, and you punished her for saving his life. Finch was white as a sheet. His entire world was crumbling around him. The nurses and residents who had laughed at Clara were now staring at her with a mixture of awe and terror. Maya looked like she was about to cry with relief. From this moment on, Thorne continued, his voice resonating with absolute power, Captain Reed is in charge of this patient's care. You and your staff will provide her with anything she asks for. Any equipment, any medication, any personnel. If you so much as question her judgment, I will have you charged with obstructing a federal operation in a time of national crisis. Do you understand me, Dr. Finch? Finch could only nod, his throat working. He had been publicly, totally, and irrevocably humiliated, stripped of his authority in his own kingdom by the very woman he had tormented. Clara stepped forward, her focus already back on the mission. I need a secure room, now, she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority no one in that room had ever heard from her. And I need a full toxicology panel, a crash cart, and 4 more grams of pralidoxime on standby. The staff, including a stunned but obedient Finch, scrambled to obey. They moved Master Sergeant Vance to a private room in the ICU, with soldiers posted outside the door. Inside, Thorne gave Clara the full briefing. The intelligence Vance was carrying isn't on a drive. It's in his head, Thorne explained. He memorized the chemical formula for the neurotoxin VX3 and the names of the buyers, a rogue state and a terror cell. If they get their hands on it, we could see attacks on a scale we've never imagined. The people who want him dead are a mercenary group called Scorpio. They're ruthless, and they're well-funded. They will not stop. They know he's here, Clara stated, checking Vance's vitals. His condition was stabilizing, but he was far from out of the woods. They know he's alive, Thorne corrected grimly, and they'll know something went wrong with their plan. Just then, a communications tech with a headset hurried into the room. Sir, we've intercepted a call. From inside the hospital. We've isolated the source. He looked at Finch, who was standing nervously in the corner, trying to appear useful. It's his cell phone. The tech played the recording. Finch's voice, tight with fury and greed, filled the small room. The target is still alive. What the hell happened? The plan was simple. I don't know who she is, some nurse, but the military is here now. Yes, ICU, room 305. You have to finish this. The rest of the payment depends on it. Thorne looked at Finch, his expression turning to ice. Finch's face crumpled in terror. No, that's not... I can explain. Before he could say another word, 2 of Thorne's soldiers seized him, slamming him against the wall. He had been more than just arrogant. He was a traitor, willing to sell out a soldier's life for money. Suddenly, Clara's head snapped up. She looked past the drama with Finch, her eyes narrowed at the hallway visible through the room's small window. General, she said, her voice a low warning. We have company. 2 men dressed as hospital orderlies were walking down the ICU hallway. They pushed a floor polishing machine, but they didn't look like janitors. They moved with the coiled, predatory grace of hunters. Their eyes weren't on the floor. They were scanning room numbers. One of them had a slight bulge under the side of his uniform that was not a wallet. Scorpio, Thorne breathed. They're already here. Lock down this room. But Clara was already moving. They'll shoot through the door. They'll kill him, she said. She opened the door just a crack. I'll draw them past. Before Thorne could object, she slipped out into the hallway, turning away from the approaching assassins, pretending to be a nurse checking a chart on the wall. The 2 men saw her. Excuse me, miss, one said, his voice a low growl. Clara turned, her face a mask of neutral politeness. Can I help you? The first man reached for the weapon under his shirt. The second moved to flank her. They thought she was a soft target, an obstacle. They were wrong. The moment the first man's hand moved, Clara exploded into motion. She dropped the chart and kicked out, not at the man, but at the heavy steel floor polisher. The machine shot sideways, slamming into the second man's knees, sending him crashing to the ground with a cry of pain. Simultaneously, she closed the distance with the first man. He was still trying to draw his suppressed pistol. She was faster. Her left hand slapped his gun hand aside, while her right hand, fingers rigid, jabbed into his throat. He gagged, stumbling backward. She didn't give him time to recover. She spun, driving her elbow into his temple with brutal force. He dropped like a stone, unconscious. The second man was getting to his feet, pulling his own weapon. Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and swung it in a vicious arc, connecting with his gun hand. There was a sickening crunch of bone. The pistol clattered to the floor. The man screamed, clutching his shattered wrist. Just then, Thorne's soldiers burst out of the room, weapons raised. They found Clara standing over two incapacitated assassins, breathing calmly, the fire extinguisher still in her hand. The entire fight had lasted less than 5 seconds. The soldiers stared at her, their expressions of shock and awe mirroring those of the ER staff from an hour earlier. Thorne came out, his own sidearm drawn. He took in the scene. "This hospital is compromised," he said, his voice grim. "We're moving him, now. Captain Jennings, get the bird spooled up. We're going to fall back Point Sierra." "I'm going with him," Clara said. It wasn't a question. "His neurological state is still fragile. If he starts to seize, I'm the only one here who knows the protocol for this specific agent." Thorne nodded. "Wouldn't have it any other way, Captain." They worked with frantic speed. Within minutes, they had Vance on a mobile gurney, hooked up to portable monitors. Flanked by a heavily armed escort, they moved through the hospital's service corridors, heading for a rooftop access point. They loaded him onto one of the waiting Blackhawks, Clara never leaving his side. As the helicopter lifted off, leaving the chaos of Metropolitan General behind, she looked down at the city lights. Her quiet life was well and truly over. Their destination was a remote, fortified cabin deep in the mountains, an old agency safe house. It was miles from any road, accessible only by air. For the next few hours, there was a tense peace. Clara worked tirelessly, monitoring Vance, adjusting his medications, her focus absolute. He drifted in and out of consciousness. Once, his eyes fluttered open and focused on her. "Angel?" he rasped, his voice rough. "Rest, Sergeant," she said softly, placing a cool hand on his forehead. "You're safe." The peace was shattered just after midnight. Motion sensors on the cabin's perimeter lit up a control panel. "Contacts!" a soldier yelled. "Multiple bogies, approaching from all sides!" Scorpio had found them. The first rounds ripped through the cabin walls, splintering wood and shattering glass. Thorne's soldiers returned fire, the roar of their assault rifles deafening in the enclosed space. The cabin became a war zone. "Keep his head down!" Clara yelled over the din, shielding Vance's body with her own as bullets whizzed past them. She was simultaneously trying to keep pressure on a bleeding wound on his leg and monitor his fluctuating heart rate. The firefight was brutal. Scorpio's mercenaries were well-equipped and determined. An RPG slammed into the side of the cabin, blowing a huge hole in the wall and sending a shower of debris over everyone. One of the soldiers went down, clutching his chest. "Man down!" Clara screamed. She crawled toward the wounded soldier under a hail of gunfire, dragging a medical kit behind her. She applied a chest seal, her hands working with practiced speed, even as the world exploded around her. "They're breaching the south wall!" Captain Jennings yelled. The fight grew more desperate. The soldiers were outnumbered, their position compromised. Clara got the wounded soldier stabilized and scrambled back to Vance's side. He was awake now, his eyes wide, adrenaline cutting through the haze of his injuries. He had a pistol in his hand, taken from a fallen mercenary. The main door to the room burst open. A huge mercenary in heavy body armor stood there, his rifle raised. He leveled it at Vance. Thorne and Jennings were pinned down across the room, unable to get a clear shot. Time seemed to slow down. The mercenary's finger tightened on the trigger. Vance tried to lift his pistol, but he was too weak. In that instant, Clara moved. She snatched the sidearm from the belt of the soldier she had just treated. She didn't aim. She didn't hesitate. She rose to one knee, the pistol coming up in a smooth, practiced motion. Crack. Crack. 2 shots, fired so close together they sounded like one. A perfect double tap. Both rounds struck the mercenary in the small, unprotected gap between his helmet and his body armor, at the base of his skull. He stood for a second, a look of surprise on his face, then collapsed in a heap. The room fell silent, save for the ringing in their ears. The remaining soldiers, Thorne and Jennings included, stared at Clara. She held the smoking pistol, her expression calm, professional, lethal. She was no longer just a medic. She was a warrior. The lull was broken by the sound of approaching helicopters, their reinforcements. The remaining Scorpio mercenaries, their leader gone and their element of surprise lost, melted back into the woods. The siege was over. The next day, the scene shifted back to the city. Dr. Alistair Finch, released on bail by his high-priced lawyers, had organized a press conference in the main lobby of Metropolitan General. He stood at a podium, looking somber and victimized, flanked by his legal team. "A harrowing ordeal," he said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. "Our hospital was invaded, our staff terrorized, and my professional reputation dragged through the mud by a rogue military faction and a deeply disturbed, violent nurse whom I had correctly identified as a threat." He was painting himself as the hero, the lone voice of reason against a tide of chaos. He was blaming Clara for everything. The reporters were eating it up, scribbling furiously, cameras flashing. "This Captain Reed, as they call her, is a menace, and I am calling for a full investigation into this gross overreach of military power and the actions of this unstable individual." He was at the height of his arrogant performance when the main doors of the hospital lobby swung open. General Marcus Thorne entered. He was in his full dress uniform, his chest a rainbow of ribbons. On one side of him walked Clara, dressed in a simple black pantsuit, her hair pulled back, the faint scar on her temple visible. She looked not like a victim, but like a dignitary. On his other side was Master Sergeant Elias Vance, in a wheelchair pushed by Captain Jennings, his leg in a cast, but his eyes clear and sharp. They were flanked by a team of stone-faced FBI agents. The press conference came to a halt. A wave of murmurs and camera flashes turned from Finch to the newcomers. Thorne walked directly to the podium, his presence silencing the room. He didn't shove Finch aside. He simply stood next to him, his authority so immense that Finch seemed to shrink. "Dr. Finch has made some serious allegations," Thorne began, his voice calm and powerful, broadcast by the microphones. "He's called Captain Reed a menace. He's called himself a victim. The truth, however, is often a little more complicated." He gestured to an aide, who plugged a device into the podium's sound system. "I believe this belongs to you, Doctor." Finch's voice, recorded from the intercepted call, filled the lobby. "The target is still alive. Yes, ICU, room 305. You have to finish this. The rest of the payment depends on it." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Finch's face, projected onto the huge screens behind him, turned from smug confidence to ashen horror. That's a fake!" he shrieked, his voice cracking. "It's a deep fake! They're framing me! This is a conspiracy!" Thorne ignored him. "Dr. Alistair Finch," he announced, his voice like a judge's gavel, "was paid a substantial amount of money by the mercenary group Scorpio to ensure that Master Sergeant Vance died on his operating table. When Captain Reed saved Vance's life, Dr. Finch sold them his location." The FBI agents moved in. They flanked Finch, one of them producing a pair of handcuffs. "No, you can't do this to me!" Finch screamed, his composure shattering completely. "I am the chief of surgery. I am a respected physician. I am innocent." He started to weep, pathetic, broken sobs, as the agents cuffed his hands behind his back and began to lead him away. His reign of terror was over, ending not with a bang, but with a sniveling, humiliating whimper. Thorne turned his attention back to the stunned press. "Now, let me tell you about the menace Dr. Finch mentioned." He looked to Clara, a deep respect in his eyes. 3 years ago, in Kandahar province, a field hospital was overrun by insurgents. A young captain, a combat medic, held them off for 2 hours, single-handedly defending her wounded patients while simultaneously performing surgery under fire. She saved 12 lives that day and was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross for her heroism. After that day, seeking a quiet life away from the violence she had endured, she tried to disappear. She took a new name and a simple job, hiding the warrior she was inside. He placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. "This is Captain Clara Reed. She is not a menace. She is a national hero. She saved Master Sergeant Vance's life not once, but 3 times in the last 24 hours. First, by diagnosing the chemical agent you all just heard about. Second, by defending him from assassins inside this very hospital. And third, by fighting alongside my men to repel a mercenary attack. This city and this country owes her a debt of gratitude. In the crowd of hospital staff watching from the sidelines, Maya, the junior nurse, stared at Clara with tears in her eyes. She began to clap. Hesitantly at first, then with more force. Another nurse joined in, then a doctor, and soon the entire lobby was filled with a thunderous, rolling ovation. It was for Clara, for the quiet, clumsy woman they had misjudged, scorned, and underestimated. It was a sound of apology, of awe, of profound respect. Later that week, in a quiet office overlooking the Potomac River, General Thorne slid a file across his desk to Clara. "Your quiet life is over, I'm afraid," he said with a small smile. "The secret's out. But your real life, the one you were meant to live, can begin again." Clara opened the file. The cover page read, "Project Nightingale, Formation of Joint Task Force Chimera, a Rapid Response Special Operations Medical Tactical Unit." "It's a new concept," Thorne explained. "A small, elite team that can deploy anywhere in the world within 3 hours, part medic, part operator. Capable of performing complex medical procedures in active combat zones. We need a leader. Someone with a unique combination of tactical skill, medical genius, and grace under pressure. There's only one name on my list." He looked at her expectantly. "The job is yours, if you want it, Commander." Clara looked at the file, then out the window. For the first time in years, she felt not the crushing weight of her past, but the exhilarating pull of a future. A future where she didn't have to hide. She closed the file and pushed it back across the desk. "I accept, General," she said, her voice clear and strong. The final scene unfolded on a military airfield. The wind was sharp, carrying the scent of jet fuel. Clara stood on the tarmac, dressed in tactical gear, her hair pulled back tightly. The wind whipped a few strands across her face, but she no longer tried to hide the faint, silvery scar on her temple. It wasn't a mark of trauma anymore. It was a medal, a testament to her survival. A C-130 Hercules stood waiting, its cargo ramp lowered, ready to take her and her new team on their first mission. She heard the sound of crutches on the pavement behind her. It was Elias Vance. He was still recovering, but he moved with the unmistakable purpose of a soldier. He stopped beside her, following her gaze to the plane. "Heard you got the band back together," he said, a smile in his voice. "Or rather, started a new one." "Something like that," Clara replied, a small smile touching her own lips. "You know," he said, turning to face her, his eyes full of a respect that went deeper than words. "When I was lying in that ER, I heard them say they were looking for an angel. I didn't understand, but now I do." He paused. "Thank you, Clara, for everything." "Just doing my job, Sergeant," she said, but the warmth in her eyes told a different story. "It's Elias," he corrected her gently, "and I have a feeling we'll be seeing each other again." He was being reassigned as an instructor and advisor to her new unit. "I have a feeling you're right," she said. An order was shouted from the plane. It was time to go. Clara looked at Elias, then at the waiting aircraft, and then at the horizon. It was a new day, a new mission. She wasn't running from her past anymore. She was flying toward her future. She gave Elias a nod, a silent promise, and turned to walk up the ramp into the belly of the beast, ready for whatever came next. We really hope you enjoyed this educational piece of content, and hope that you could understand the moral lessons behind it. The story of Captain Clara Reed teaches us a powerful lesson about judging others. Just because someone appears quiet or unassuming does not mean they are weak or incompetent. True strength and skill often lie hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to be revealed. It also shows that arrogance and cruelty, like that of Dr. Finch, ultimately lead to ruin. Doing the right thing, even when it's hard and comes at a great personal cost, is always the right choice. True character is not defined by your title or your status, but by your actions in moments of crisis. What would you have done if you were in Clara's shoes? Would you have risked your career to save a stranger? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this story, make sure to smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Have a nice rest of your day.